All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get us started here today. I'm Kelly Bourne, Director of the Cyber Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and an affiliate here at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. So glad to be hosting today's webinar. It'll be a conversation on global perspectives on crypto asset regulation. And I'm really glad to be joined today by two speakers, Aman Nair of the Center for Internet and Society in India and Valerie Shen of the Third Way in DC. At CIS, at the Center for Internet and Society in India, they conduct interdisciplinary research on internet and digital tech, including questions around internet governance, telecom reform, digital privacy, and cybersecurity. And Aman, who is joining us today, leads the financial tech research agenda at CIS and has been focusing on crypto assets and blockchain technologies for some time. Valerie Shen is the new director of Third Way's National Security Program and Cyber Enforcement Initiative. The cyber enforcement work is really a nonpartisan effort to strengthen government's abilities to identify, stop, and bring malicious cyber actors to justice. And Third Way has really been a pioneer on the cyber enforcement front. Prior to joining Third Way, Valerie served as the Chief National Security Counsel to Congress's House Oversight and Reform Committee, and there she oversaw national security and homeland security matters, including cyber operations. So really glad to be joined by Valerie and Aman here today. Before turning it over to them, I'll just provide a little bit of background. This is a really fascinating and fast-moving field, so I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Since the launch of Bitcoin, the world's first cryptocurrency, about a decade ago, the market has grown to over 2.4 trillion, tripling in value in just the last year alone. And looking just at Bitcoin and Ethereum, they are some of the more prevalent cryptocurrencies, but are just two of several thousand cryptocurrencies now in circulation. The growth of this market, I think, poses really important questions, not just for the economy, of course, and financial stability, but for democracy, the environment, and beyond. So I'm hoping we can touch on a lot of those today. Looking, just at the economy, last June, I imagine many here saw that El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. It was the first country to do so. The Biden administration is expected any day now to commission a study into creating a digital dollar. Many countries are exploring this. And yet, of course, there are real economic and financial concerns. There is a lot of volatility in this market from month to month. Many have argued these aren't even necessarily real currencies. They're not good for small transactions because they have to be verified in the blockchain. Miners have to go in and receive payments and include them and code them cryptographically to secure them on the blockchain. So you can't really use this for Starbucks transactions or things of smaller scales right now. And there's a volume and transaction challenge. Bitcoin can do about 7 transactions a second. Ethereum is evidently capped right now at around 15, whereas Visa or MasterCard handle, close to 2,000 transactions a second. So a lot of economic questions here. Environmentally, Bitcoin and Ethereum together consume about as much electric energy annually as the country of Indonesia. So many questions here. And then a lot of democratic and human rights implications. We have seen cryptocurrencies allowing funding for pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong. In 2020, we saw people donating to pro-democracy protesters having their bank accounts frozen. In Belarus and Russia and Nigeria, we saw pro-democracy movements also suffering from the state's ability to monitor and freeze bank accounts. And so actors started moving to crypto. We've seen this in the Ukraine as well, with Ukrainian officials asking crypto companies to freeze any accounts belonging to Russians, and many of those companies complying. Just last week, we have seen that sympathizers with the Ukrainian cause have raised more than $60 million through cryptocurrency donations. So many important democratic implications. Many privacy advocates are fans of cryptocurrency, arguing that financial privacy is just as important as our communications privacies, that our spending habits say a lot about us in terms of the political books we're purchasing, the communities that we are supporting financially. So lots of democratic and human rights benefits, but also many concerns, which I think Valerie will speak to more around the use of cryptocurrencies and financing illicit transactions as well. So the last thing I'll say is that there are a lot of benefits, a lot of concerns. It remains very unclear how best to regulate this market, which is why I have been looking forward to today's conversations. Many governments want really broad authorities. Some governments aren't allowing cryptocurrencies at all. China has banned them, as have about a half dozen other countries. Other governments who are permitting cryptocurrencies are very concerned that carve-outs are going to be used for tax and regulatory avoidance. There are concerns about the risks that they could pose to the financial system, given how few tools there are to see and manage these risks, not unlike was true of the derivatives market in the mid-early 2000s. So you see countries struggling with this. States in the US have taken very different approaches. Wyoming is now praised as the most crypto-friendly state. Iowa and a handful of others have issued warnings about investing in crypto and are viewed as much less friendly. As I said, the Biden administration is expected to issue an executive order on crypto policy literally any minute, commissioning a study, as I said, into a digital dollar, but also calling for an analysis into environmental risks, financial stability concerns, and more. And just last month, we saw the Justice Department name its first director of a national cryptocurrency enforcement team to identify and deal with misuses of cryptocurrencies and other digital assets. So there is a lot going on here and a lot of interesting questions posed. I'm going to now turn it over first to Aman, who wrote a fantastic report. And Aman, I'm hoping you could just maybe put a link in the chat on the potential benefits and pitfalls associated with crypto assets, the challenges in regulating them, sort of scanning international efforts so far to govern these, and then proposing recommendations on what a regulatory regime, both in India, but also globally, should consider here. So I'll have Aman first take 10 or 15 minutes to walk through that. And then Valerie, you've been studying the rapidly increasing abuse of crypto assets for money laundering and sanctions evasions and other cyber crimes. Would love to turn to you to talk us through some of the challenging uses of crypto and just the state of crypto regulation in the US more broadly. I know that that's sort of fragmented across agencies, and there are a range of challenges in developing a balanced regulatory framework here in the US and also globally. So I would like to have about 20 to 30 minutes for Aman and Valerie's remarks, and then we'll save 20 or 30 minutes in the Q&A for questions from the audience. And you can go ahead and start entering questions now or as speakers are presenting, and I will do my best to moderate those during the last 20 or 30 minutes of this conversation. So with that, I will stop. Aman, I'll turn it over to you, but thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kelly. I'm really excited to be here. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, good. So hi, everyone. Like Kelly mentioned, I work for the Center for Internet and Society in India. And over the last year, we've been working on a report to advise the Indian government on what a crypto asset regulation would look like, which is sort of what I'm going to be presenting here today. So at a very basic level, I think the first thing we just start with is what is a crypto asset and why we call it a crypto asset as opposed to a cryptocurrency, which is more colloquially known as. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are sort of the prototypical idea of what a crypto asset is. They were sort of the first evolution of crypto assets, but as the markets evolve, as technologies evolve, what we've seen is that a number of technologies have entered which don't necessarily claim to be currencies, but they definitely do fulfill the crypto criteria, right? And so what we decided is to sort of rely on a sort of broader definition. We really like this one from the FCA in the United Kingdom. We think that this will just help frame the discussion going forward. We're not just talking about assets that act as currencies, we're talking about sort of a wider marketplace of currencies. And keeping that in mind, we just wanted to outline a few potential use cases that governments might find interesting for crypto assets. The most notable one, again, with things like Bitcoin is where they claim to act as a means of payment or a means of exchange. Those are sort of what their initial proposals for these crypto assets were. What we're seeing in reality is that they're actually acting more like tradable assets. We also see that crypto assets can be used as a means of capital generation, which is what initial coin offerings are. And then you have sort of crypto assets as financial instruments, whether it be funds or derivatives. And finally, you have crypto asset related services. Those would be your crypto escrows or just your crypto exchanges as well. So yeah, with that context, one of the key things that we think governments need to look at are sort of the pros and cons of regulating cryptocurrencies and crypto assets. Like Kelly mentioned, there seems to be a discussion with some countries going for a ban, some countries looking to heavily regulate, and some countries and states looking to take a lighter approach. And we think that all states generally have to consider these benefits and limitations when making that decision. The benefits by proponents of Bitcoin and crypto assets in general generally follow the same themes. They speak about the decentralized and verifiable nature that crypto transactions allow you to have. They sort of talk about the security and pseudo confidentiality that comes with these transactions, which again is why sort of privacy actors really seem to be in favor of this. From a development perspective, because we were writing this report for India, one of the things we looked at was sort of the impact of crypto assets on impoverished communities and the potential they had for impoverished communities. So one of the things we identified was that proponents of crypto assets would talk about how they would reduce transaction costs by sort of bypassing the need for individuals to be part of a centralized formal banking system and thereby getting rid of banking fees. Another thing that they would really help with is to facilitate cross-border transactions and remittances. And so in that way, they would sort of act as a tool for financial inclusion. And finally, the last benefit is as a tool for verifying asset ownership. That would be your NFTs and your tokens that would allow people to, when they had ownership of them, would allow them to have access to certain services or goods. And while those benefits are undeniably true to an extent, I think what's really important for us is to sort of be very realistic about the limitations that crypto assets also have. Most notably is the high environmental costs, oftentimes which rival complete states. What we actually did see in our research was that while certain individuals claim they did sort of eliminate traditional banking costs, what we found was that they simply replaced them with external costs, right? So that would be your cost of escrow or your cost of crypto exchange fees themselves. We also saw that the marketplace tends towards a natural monopoly since a few actors tend to dominate the mining process in a lot of crypto assets, especially like Bitcoin. From a state perspective, should a crypto asset become a widely accepted means of exchange, then it would create a lot of problems for central banks to implement effective monetary policies. Another thing we sort of wanted to look at was the potential for crypto assets to become such a means of exchange. And what we saw is that currently money, as we know it, has just far too many network externalities, and that the switching cost is far too high for people to actually make the switch to crypto. And lastly, we saw that given the lack of digital literacy in a lot of developing nations, and given sort of the initial upfront costs involved in setting up crypto in impoverished communities, that they actually don't have any real effect on financial inclusion. And lastly, as Valerie will touch on in much more detail, there is a growing number of incidences of crypto being used for illegal activities. So with that, we just wanted to, when we were sort of thinking about how to develop a regulatory regime for the Indian government, we decided first to look at about 11 different jurisdictions. And from doing that, we sort of identified a few key trends that we thought were important. The first is that crypto, for the most part, is not accepted as a means of exchange, and it's not accepted as legal tender. El Salvador, of course, being a very significant outlier in that. As Kelly again mentioned, crypto assets seem in a lot of jurisdictions to be under the ambit of multiple regulatory bodies. I know in India, there's 3 regulatory bodies that claim to have control over crypto assets. And as a result of this sort of internal departmental fighting, I think a number of states have identified the need for crypto-specific regulation. And something also that we saw in their identification of that need is that states seem to be drawing a distinction between crypto assets and the underlying technology, blockchain technology, that is. Another sort of key trend that we identified was that crypto assets don't really have a cohesive taxation structure. A number of different crypto assets, depending on jurisdiction and type, are taxed very differently. And there just seems to be a lack of clarity around that, which seems to be affecting consumers and investors. Something that we found particularly interesting was that crypto assets are required to be compliant with all AML and CFT norms across the board in a number of jurisdictions. which, given sort of the concerns around their use for illicit activities, I think there's a discussion to be had on whether these norms actually go far enough in the case of crypto assets. And I think the last thing we identified is that the EU really is setting the benchmark for regulators in terms of crypto assets. So keeping all that in mind, we essentially in our report boiled down our recommendations into what we thought would be a good regulatory framework and a step-by-step process for the Indian government. So just a little bit of a disclaimer, these measures are with the Indian government in mind. So we did divide them into two different types, short-term and long-term. On the short-term, we advocated for a clearing of steering clear of a ban on private crypto assets. We believe that, given how entrenched crypto assets are within the financial institutions and financial sector in most countries already, and also particularly given the fact that it's a cross-national issue, it's a transnational issue, that any individual state banning crypto assets would not really have much of an impact. The only real impact we think we can see is that it would push crypto transactions into an unregulated dark market. And we think states are better off sort of implementing much more stringent regulations as opposed to criminalizing crypto assets and then having them unregulated in the black market. The next suggestion is this sort of India-specific one, wherein we recommend that the regulatory bodies that exist use their ad hoc powers that are granted to them to bring crypto assets under their purview in the time being, in the absence of a dedicated legislation. So moving on, we have the sort of long-term measures. These are sort of our flagship recommendations to the government. The first one, very simply, is just to have a specific regulatory framework, specific dedicated legislation for crypto asset regulation, simply because the nature of the technology is such that current existing regulation just will not cover it. As part of that, one thing that we were very, very we emphasized mainly is the need for clearer definitions. India has had attempts at defining or creating a crypto asset law in the past, but they've always stumbled at the definition phase. So we really suggest having a broader definition for crypto assets, having definitions for crypto asset service providers, and even introducing a category system wherein different types of crypto assets are categorized differently and have different regulations placed on them accordingly. Again, similar to many other countries, we sort of recommend that the scope of regulations is limited to crypto assets themselves and doesn't affect underlying technology, simply because we believe that that could have an effect on innovation. One of the measures we sort of took a lot of inspiration from the EU and even New York was that we suggested the introduction of a licensing system. We believe a licensing system would really allow for states to more effectively monitor crypto asset activities within the state, and also more effectively ensure that environmental and consumer protection measures are implemented on entities that are conducting crypto asset activities. So yeah, that just takes me pretty nicely on to how we handle environmental concerns. One thing we stressed to the government was not to fall into the trap of just listening that, or just to say that, well, a certain percentage of crypto assets are being mined using renewable energy and therefore it's okay. Something we wanted to bring out was that renewable energies used to mine crypto assets have an opportunity cost, right? And so using renewable energy to mine crypto assets takes renewable energy away from other causes, let's say causes that may help us move towards a more sustainable global economy in the future. So what we suggest is to have very clear mining limitations, similar to limitations that you have in states like Venezuela, where in certain areas you're just not allowed to mine because they may overpower the grid, especially in low-income areas. And also to introduce sort of a Pigouvian tax on mining itself, so to disincentivize it at a very large scale. Similarly, in the licensing system, we suggest consumer protection measures, obligations to act in good faith, marketing and advertising regulations, things like that, that would be applied onto crypto asset exchanges to ensure that consumers are properly informed and are able to make clear decisions when purchasing and trading crypto assets. So speaking on the volatility of crypto assets, this is sort of what the central bank is most worried about in India. Something that we sort of proposed is that Given the nature of crypto assets, their extreme volatility, and also the fact that traditional means of state action on volatile goods don't really apply here, we think that it's probably better off that states focus their efforts on not allowing the volatility to spill over into the wider financial market. So one way we really see that happening is by limiting the role of financial institutions like banks in holding crypto assets or conducting institutional trading. Again, the next point would be, I guess, Valerie, there's a place to speak on it, but we think there's definitely a need to extend AML and CFD norms on crypto assets and crypto asset exchanges to prevent their use on illicit activities. Again, in the Indian context, we sort of recommend a oversight body be created that specifically looks at crypto assets, and that the taxation regime be clarified. On the taxation point, I think, like in general, it's just a good idea for states, considering that even in the research we did, it seemed as if, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 jurisdictions, there seemed to be a multitude of taxation regulations that apply to crypto assets that sort of all spoke over each other. And finally, the sort of one recommendation that we feel the most passionately about, I say, is stablecoin specific regulation. So for those of you that don't know, stablecoins are a specific type of crypto asset that have their value pegged to a fixed value and are backed by certain commodities. So the most common one, the most famous one is Tether. So Tether is pegged to the US dollar. So one Tether is always equal to one US dollar, and it's backed by a certain number of commodities. Stablecoins are used as a means of exchange within the crypto market space. And because of this, they sort of have a unique role and a unique position in being particularly volatile, particularly vulnerable to creating a domino or cascading effect of a financial collapse should they fail. So we think that any government looking to take private crypto asset regulation seriously really has to spend its time on stablecoin regulation, sort of identify the actors involved, identify why there needs to be a higher regulatory standard, and sort of implement regulations similar to those that you would see in the banking sector. So yeah, with that, I'm done. I've shared the link to the report in chat. If anyone would like to go through it in any more detail, please let me know. Kelly, back to you. Thanks for having me again.
Aman, thanks so much. Really appreciated those comments. I'm going to turn it now over to Valerie, but would encourage folks. I'm seeing questions come into the Q&A, so please keep adding those and I will be monitoring them. But Valerie, over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. So the Third Way Cyber Enforcement Initiative was born out of the observation that a lot of very good work was being done on how to defend systems against malicious actors, but not that much work on how to actually deter them from attacking in the first place. So the next phase of this initiative will take a closer look at cryptocurrency and its role in helping those criminals launder money and terrorist financing and a lot of the other cyber crimes that Aman had mentioned. So starting with the core question of how would you improve law enforcement outcomes on cybercrime? Because it's complicated. There's the executive branch, the actual agents, their lack of resources, but then there's the entire statutory regime, and then the agency regulations on top of that. And everyone at every level has a different sort of incentive and viewpoint and agenda in how they would want to go about it. So as we think we all know, there's been a huge surge of ransomware, and a lot of it has been enabled by cryptocurrency. However, there's also been somewhat even of a huger surge of legitimate activity. And the illicit activity is actually only a small fraction of that. So when you're looking at regulatory framework, I think I mentioned balance before, because it's not practical for law enforcement or for the crypto advocacy community or anyone to think that only their interests, only their equities are going to be taken into account. And it can get very complicated very quickly, as you can see. So potential tools that could help law enforcement better catch cyber actors include, new statutory authorities. So for example, in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there was a provision to give OFAC, the Treasury Department, greater power to freeze crypto exchanges with crypto if they're was a limit of, if there was an amount above $10,000, I believe. And that also did not happen without controversy due to the transparency regulations, but it's just a small piece really of what we're seeing in the United States, because as everyone sees the data of the criminal activity rising, the government really feels forced to react, but it's happening so quickly that they are only really now catching up to thinking through what a comprehensive system would look like. So I think Kelly mentioned earlier that, you know, globally, there's certainly a variety of, I don't want to call them models, but China and 8 other countries have completely banned cryptocurrencies. El Salvador has now made Bitcoin legal tender, and the European Union is in the process of a markets and crypto assets framework where the main benefit, I think, would be to have one license across 27 states. So looking at the positive, efficient side of crypto regulation. And there's certainly a lot of room for improvement in the United States. So currently, the way that cryptocurrency is regulated is basically agency by agency. There's almost no crypto-specific policies or provisions. So for example, the Securities Exchange Commission calls cryptocurrency a security and regulates it on that status. The CFTC, unsurprisingly, calls them a commodity. And the IRS calls them property so that they can tax them under capital gains. But none of these agencies actually agree. I think there's a point made earlier about the definitions being a really difficult thing. And in addition to the sort of educational, intellectual idea of the one definition, there's also what I would call turf wars across the federal government. Everybody wants to have more authority, more jurisdiction, which is a natural thing for an agency to want to do. But that means we have inconsistent responses across the federal government and no central organizing feature to implement policies that will work across the board. So the Biden administration very recently recognized this and signed an executive order that basically sent the whole of government to study, that would be involved in crypto, to study what kind of framework would work for this. And I think it was well received as a great start, but it's really just a plan to have a plan at this point. To me, it's a really open question, what direction they were going to go in, who the lead agency was going to be, who's even directing the interagency process, because there's at least a dozen, probably more major agencies that have serious equities, not just on the law enforcement side, of course, but the financial, everything else about cryptocurrency. So another aspect of criminal activity with cryptocurrency is we are seeing now in evasion of sanctions, right? So there's been some reporting about Russia using sanctions and cryptocurrency specifically to evade the massive sanctions put upon them. It turns out that the sanctions are so massive, cryptocurrency as a volume can't really handle enough to make a difference. But that doesn't mean that authoritarian governments won't use this type of method to potentially run around foreign policy consequences put upon them, right? So going forward, we're basically going to be asking these big picture questions and thinking about what stakeholders need to be in the room and what conversations do they need to have in order to really flesh out all of these details. And personally, I think it's going to be a long and difficult slog. We're really at the beginning of the process right now. And there's a lot of room for good ideas on how to do it. And with that, Kelly, I'll take it back to you.
Great, Valerie, thank you so much, and Aman as well. So we want to go ahead and now just open it up for questions. We have a couple already. I think the first was wanting to better understand the environmental impact. And some people, I think, aren't aware of why this would be the case. Typically, and I'll let Aman or Valerie expand on this, but it's the cost associated with mining, with actually validating the cryptocurrencies within the blockchain that can be very energy consuming. And so I don't know if Aman or Valerie, you want to expand on that. I remember we did one of these webinars with Ron Diebert, I don't know, a year ago or so. And I remember in the book that he had written him talking about a simple Google search requiring as much energy as boiling a cup of tea. And, and I think people sometimes miss the costs of these digital transactions. So if either of you want to expand on that, please do, or otherwise I have some more data on that as well I can share.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I think everything you said makes a lot of sense. I think the direct costs associated with crypto assets in general are sort of very well known. People often come up with statistics of how they rival states. I think a point that again we wanted to sort of make is that there are also secondary environmental concerns associated with crypto that go beyond just the mining, or something that are linked directly to the mining. So you're looking at the e-waste accrued from mining activities. You're looking at sort of the incidental electricity used in heating and cooling of supercomputers. Speaking from a developing nation perspective, that is energy that, while again, probably not the most, while not the largest amounts, can significantly go to helping a multitude of people who don't have access to it. So yeah, Kelly, back to you.
Yeah, I remember one alarming statistic noting that just a single Bitcoin block can consume as much energy as an American household over 72 days or something like that. I mean, the energy consumption here is concerning. Okay, we have another question that's about the sort of shadow banking system and how we might help to shift the incentives there if there are regulations, if there are maybe limitations in banking fees. What kinds of mechanisms might support some kind of shift in the shadow banking system?
Yeah, so I can take this again. So again, speaking sort of from the developing country perspective, I think the suggestion proposed in the question would address half the problem, right? It would sort of address the problem from the side of the wealthy nation sending in money. I think from the developing nation perspective, you still have a number of people who don't have access to banking institutions, who don't have bank accounts. So, just incentivizing by lowering banking fees may not necessarily work unless you sort of incentivize, it's part of a wider sort of strategy to incentivize banking within the developing nation itself. That's sort of where crypto proponents speak really highly of crypto, because theoretically all you would need is a cell phone. And in developing nations, mobile penetration, despite technological sort of limitations, is very high. So yeah, theoretically, reducing fees on international remittances and stuff would be a great first step, but there would be more.
Valerie, anything you want to add to that, or I can move on?
I was already looking at the next questions.
Yeah, happy to. So I was going to turn to this question about user rights to privacy versus how do we handle detecting illegal behavior and abuse. And this is the same kind of question we end up running into in the encryption debate and so many other debates where you've got privacy on the one hand and law enforcement on the other hand. Curious how you guys are thinking about that specific to the crypto conversation.
So as you were just mentioning, Kelly, I think it's analogous to the battle that we've always had over the illegal activity and protecting civil liberties. It's just a different medium at this point. And we're at a moment where the regulations for cryptocurrency haven't caught up to, say, the traditional financial system who has well-established anti-money laundering and anti-counter terrorist financing tools. We are on the path to that, or at least there's a recognition that we need to be on the path to that. But of course, it has to be tailored for crypto. And right now, I certainly think the balance is on the side of, we need more law enforcement tools to fight this cybercrime wave. At the same time, I think that process will play out naturally as the privacy advocates, furiously advocate for their side. And all I can say is that I hope that there will be room for compromise, because from what I've seen, at least so far, the sides are pretty polarized and pretty set in their views.
Yes, we have seen this, and in many instances also when we run into questions with the social media companies and trying to secure data access there. And again, these sort of tensions between privacy and transparency and law enforcement. Aman, anything that you want to add to the privacy versus law enforcement conversation from an India perspective, perhaps?
Yeah, so in terms of the privacy debate happening in India around crypto assets, I think something that we consistently sort of strive to point out is that the idea of privacy in crypto asset spaces in terms of a regular user are sort of, well, I don't want to say a myth, but they're not sort of as absolute as they're made out to be, right? A lot of times individuals are accessing crypto assets through crypto asset exchanges. And in India, at least, if you want to access a crypto asset exchange, you want to be a customer, you have to submit government ID. You have to follow a KYC procedure, right? And the government can and has spoken to crypto asset exchanges and attempted to achieve or sort of receive information about individuals who own wallets. And so even from a privacy perspective, it's important to remember that most individuals are still accessing crypto assets through institutions who will have some form of defining information about them.
Thank you, Aman. Now I want to turn to this question about Wyoming, and that has been an interesting test case here in the United States. For those who aren't familiar, I think I mentioned before that Wyoming is now praised as the most crypto-friendly state in the United States. This was due in part to it having created a new type of bank to accommodate crypto assets. And so we have a question here from the audience about Wyoming purchasing the first piece of land in crypto crowdfunding from one of the city governments there. And a question around how you guys think about this. I'm not sure, Aman, if you're as familiar what has been going on there, but concerns that this might pose for you. I mean, we've seen on the flip side, as I think I said, Iowa and more than 10 other states that have issued warnings about crypto. Iowa had introduced a bill prohibiting the state from accepting crypto payments. So you see just a whole laboratory of experiments happening here in the US, but curious if anyone has thoughts on Wyoming.
I'll just say that, first of all, I think the states who are trying to ban crypto, personally, I think whether someone likes it or not, crypto is going to be around for a while in the United States. Secondly, I think whatever steps Wyoming takes, or what any state takes to create a new regime for cryptocurrency is going to open itself to opportunities for additional cyber criminals too. But this is natural, right? As the rules change, the crimes are easier to commit in some ways, and then the regulation, the law enforcement has to catch up with that. So personally, I am for a whole of government approach. I know in the United States, we're very proud of our experimentation, and maybe Wyoming's model one day can be the national model. But to me, the main problem is having consistency in its treatment across the board.
Aman, anything you want to add to that? Or we have another question going back to the environmental challenges that are posed.
No, sorry, I don't think I know enough about Wyoming's policies.
Yes, nor would I expect that to be the case. So questions about the environmental impact and whether there are alternatives to this. How do you guys see this playing out long term? And the specific question was if this is stemming from the duplication and inefficiency of the mining process. And maybe if you guys want to just quickly explain how mining works, I think that might be helpful for this audience. But just this question around, are these environmental costs inherent and unavoidable, or what do we see in terms of opportunities to mitigate those in the future? And then if there are more questions, please go ahead from the audience and add those in. And otherwise, I have a number of my own that I can throw at you guys.
Sorry, Valerie, would you like to go first?
Oh no, I was just going to say my understanding of mining is pretty high level. All I know is that, from my understanding, that people are essentially trying to play the lottery by using resource-intensive materials. But that, to me, does not seem. I don't study this side as closely, but that to me does not seem necessary, certainly. And I'm an environmentalist, so that's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, maybe I can take a stab at trying to explain mining. Mining really, as a sort of an overarching term, is just a way that an extra block is added to the blockchain. But when we use the word mining colloquially, we're often talking about the proof of work system, which is the mining, the consensus mechanism that's used in crypto assets like Bitcoin. And I think the simplest way I can sort of explain it is sort of just thinking over a room of 100 people and a computer generating a math problem. And the first person to solve the math problem gets to add a block to the blockchain. And the reward for solving that problem is a certain amount of Bitcoin. So it is really in solving this math problem that a lot of the energy is used in the mining process. And so there are alternatives. The most famous alternative is one known as proof of stake, where instead of sort of having people compete to solve an equation, you're sort of distributing the ability to add a block to the people who have more of a stake within the block or who own most of the block. So, you have systems like Ethereum claiming to want to eventually move to a POS system, which is, again, in theory, more energy efficient than the mining systems that we have in Bitcoin. I can also just take a shot at the second part of that question, if that's okay, which is on CBDCs. So we actually just started our work on CBDCs at CIS, and I think, again, one thing sort of that we consistently stress to people is that CBDCs are very different from crypto assets. They can be the same, but they don't necessarily have to. So you look at CBDCs like the digital yuan, like that is not a crypto asset. So yeah, theoretically, a CBDC could function perfectly well with sort of a fraction of the environmental costs that are associated with crypto assets like Bitcoin.
Great, thank you both. So we now have a question just about the central bank and digital currencies there, and also exchanges for trading cryptocurrencies. What do you guys see, I guess starting really with the central bank question, what do you see as sort of best practices that central banks are considering in this space? What is sort of most concerning to you? And I know obviously with Biden considering a potential digital asset for the US, this has become sort of a thorny issue.
I'm sorry, you got that. Could you just repeat the question?
Question about the role of central banks here in managing digital currencies and what we've seen and what we might be concerned about.
I was just gonna say real quickly that I guess what struck me looking through this debate is, originally the main champions of cryptocurrency valued it for its decentralization, for its honestly lack of regulation, anti-government sentiment built in. And to me, the idea of central bank digital currencies is just going against that, because now you have a state-controlled, state-regulated, top-down enforced model. So again, for the reasons we discussed so far, there's some pros and there's some cons to that, but it's certainly in the opposite direction of what I think most advocates consider a crypto innovation, right?
Great, thank you. So then a question about sort of the role of the dark web here and cryptocurrencies being traded in that venue. Anything that you guys want to share on that front?
So I'm not really sure on the extent to which crypto assets are traded on the dark web. My knowledge of it is sort of limited to when a long time ago I found out what the Silk Road was, and that was sort of like when I understood that crypto assets were initially being used for illicit purposes. I think it would be a fair assumption to make that the growth of crypto assets have had a significant boost from their use in the dark web, though I'm sure Valerie is much better placed to answer this than I am.
Yeah, my knowledge of this is, well, generally, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a lot of cybercrime is done by uninformed actors, really ransomware as a service. Someone is building a program and giving it to them. And I don't want to say a monkey could do it, but it's meant to be low barrier of entry. And they don't need to use the dark web in order to sort of mix and launder their crypto most of the time. That being said, there are dark web exchanges. And I think it was the Secret Service who sort of made the point that generally speaking, if you're on the dark web, it's because you are steeped in really illicit activity. It's human trafficking, it's arms sales. So the anonymity aspect has to be more ironclad for the criminal.
Great, thank you. Okay, I wanted to turn now, just while we're talking about sort of regulatory bodies, and I think really this is probably more a question for you, Valerie, on whether one federal body is possible here for oversight, what you see as the biggest obstacle to that possibility.
So the United States, relative to the rest of the world, actually already has a more fragmented regulatory system. Like we have, 5 agencies for this aspect of banks when another country would just have the one ministry. So depending on, your political leanings, sure, you can make the argument. I would imagine the left would make the argument that an independent, empowered, dedicated, regulator, even a new agency or new sub-agency would make perfect sense. But then on the other side of government organization, you say there's so much government bloat, which there's so many overlapping jurisdictions. Do we really want another agency without clear lanes of working and all the complications that come with that? So that was a really long-winded way of saying, I think it's just going to come down to practicality. And to me, practicality includes politics, like what people can end up agreeing on. And there's just going to be, internal power dynamics from that way. So for example, I'm not saying the FBI is saying this, but the FBI is a very, lauded, well-known agency, high approval marks. They probably have more sway, in their opinion, honestly, of how this overall system is going to work. And the other states make their arguments, but to me, that's the kind of dynamic that'll be happening to figure out if it could be a central or dedicated regulator. But personally, I don't know. My gut feeling is no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I have the same concern. Just a quick add-on to that, Valerie, because it is a related one. Where do you think we should start regulating? What is most urgent here if you had to pick, a piece of this to tackle? And then Aman, I'd like to move to you with a question on consumer protection and the marketing advertising questions, which I'll elaborate on.
Well, on the illicit activity side, I would say for national security reasons, it really is trying to get at the ransomware actors, and they're largely from Russia or Eastern Europe. And that also has its own challenges because even when you are able to attribute the attack, you don't have the sovereignty necessarily, or you can't prove that this, hacking group was backed by the nation state, et cetera. So, sorry, I forgot the rest of the question.
It sounds like you would start on the ransomware front, that you feel that as being most urgent.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And the national implications being that, as we've seen in these really big attacks, it involves critical infrastructure. Most companies, we actually don't really know. We don't know how many ransomware attacks have been going on. The estimates are based on what people can try to discern, but the reality is that's only a fraction of the actual ransomware attacks because companies and individuals, they don't have incentives right now to actually make these reports, right? It's embarrassing saying like someone got past our security system. If they paid the ransom, they don't want to disclose that either. So the ransomware is an increasing market. It's, again, low barrier for entry. It's a really good deal for the aspiring criminal to make a lot of money. It's a really good rate of return. So it's going to continue to increase. And without some focus on that, we'll see a lot more implications with, again, critical infrastructure, government websites, sort of core homeland security issues.
Yeah, this point you make about the lack of reporting on ransomware incidents and payments is such an interesting one. And I know there have been talks in government and CISA about, do we mandate those? And there's been I think MIT has been doing some interesting modeling to try and estimate what that looks like, since we can't get an accurate beat on it. And it's so challenging from an insurance and other perspectives. So thank you for that. Aman, there's a question now about consumer protection and your advice in your report about regulating marketing and advertising activities, and any countries or markets that are doing this well now. Would be curious, there's a lot of marketing and advertising. We've seen it, the massive growth in this industry. Wondering what you're seeing there.
Yeah, so when we wrote the report, our goal with that was just for the Indian government to adopt some formal guidelines. Marketing and advertising guidelines of crypto in India are really lax, and so we've been working with them to sort of identify how we can begin that. In terms of specifics and sort of jurisdictions that are doing it really well, we're big admirers, again, we use proposed regulations, wherein in general they have a system of white papers, wherein if you are an issuer of a crypto asset, you have to sort of list out all the details of your crypto asset, of your business model, all these different things into a white paper that is publicly available, that has to consistently be referred to in your marketing, in your advertising, and which can easily be accessible to the public that you are advertising to. So we think that's really the benchmark that states should aspire to moving forward in the marketing front.
Great, thank you. So coming back to a question on regulation here, and I imagine maybe we start with Valerie, but I imagine you might both have relevant comments here. Just the intersection between tech regulators and financial regulators. And I don't know that we really have tech regulators in America based on my experience so far. So this may actually be a more relevant question in India or for other countries. But yeah, just how do you guys think about the potential division of responsibilities here?
Yeah, to your point, I'm trying to think what is a obvious tech regulator in the United States. But if you're framing in those groups, my thought goes to, well, they'll have very different incentive structures, right? Like they're going to want different things because the financial market, they want to innovate. They want this to be the economic future. Tech wants to develop its own technologies, and they might have privacy surveillance concerns. But to me, they're overlapping, but not similar motivations and how they would approach it.
Aman, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so in India, we actually do have an independent, so we have a Ministry of Information Technology that would, I guess, be our primary tech regulator. I think what we're seeing with crypto assets in India specifically is that there's clearly a bias towards financial regulators as opposed to sort of tech regulators, to the point where sort of tech regulators are actively deferring. You know, like we've even had Supreme Court judgments wherein they refer to the primary regulatory body as being the central bank. And so that's been the theme of discussion around crypto assets. Like it's always been, you know, either a securities body or a central bank that should take charge of its regulation.
Thank you. Now, I now want to turn to a question on diversity and this comment that in the crypto space, you know, a lot of the venture capitalists and crypto company founders have tended to be from a particular group. And my experience here in Silicon Valley and those that I know in this space is that, yes, they do tend to be Caucasian and male for the most part. Curious how you guys think about challenges around diversity here, if there is some, you know, capacity for regulatory dialogue that isn't so skewed. What are you seeing? How are you thinking about diversity in this space?
Well, I really think of it in the same framework as diversity in cybersecurity in general, right? I think similar portionments exist for there. And one thing I've thought a lot about that might help break that down or try to remove the barrier is, I think a lot of people of color or women or just people who are out there think of this stereotype, right, of what the cyber guy is. It's like the guy in the basement with the hoodie. And they're thinking, I have to be that, right, in order to be a cybersecurity expert. And we all know it's not like that at all. We're not programming in someone's basement, right? But I think there's this sort of mythology around, oh, cyber, it's a little bit, you know, too much for me. It's too, you know, it's this very technical thing that I'm never going to truly understand. So to that end, I haven't thought through all the reforms, but I would love there to be more, you know, public awareness and public education of just generally what cybersecurity policy entails and how it affects people's everyday lives. And it's not just at this highly technical level.
Thank you, Aman. Anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I think, again, in the Indian context, I think diversity, while not based on race, is, I think, primarily gender and caste and class oriented. I also think that the disparity of diversity in India is much higher insofar as, you know, you have, I think it'd be fair to say about close to 80 to 90% of the population not actively represented within government. Again, it's particularly difficult in sort of cybersecurity and sort of cyberspaces in general, simply because you're dealing with populations, especially sort of like you sort of take women up, lower caste individuals, those have sort of historically low digital penetration rates, right? I think one thing that we as CIS are really sort of particular about is when we define our policies, when we sort of identify areas we want to research and sort of suggestions we want to make is to reach out to bodies in the space and sort of like use our platform to help them. So, whether that be a labor union, whether that be a women's group working on tech, I think sort of given the extent of a lack of diversity in India, that's sort of the way I see forward.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to combine a couple of last questions here and then try and spare a minute at the end for you guys each to have any sort of closing comments. A question about systemic risk to the global economy. And I think I made a note at the outset about how governments are concerned about the lack of visibility into this marketplace, which some have likened to the same lack of visibility we saw with the derivatives market back around 2007. So questions about that. I also thought this question around traceability and retrievability was interesting, especially after seeing colonial and other, industrial attacks where we have seen a surprising amount of traceability that perhaps wasn't anticipated. So would be curious to hear your thoughts on either of those. So traceability, retrievability, what we know about that, or systemic risk and concerns there.
So I don't have studies for this, but my understanding is that people think Bitcoin, for example, is a lot less traceable than it actually is, right? People think it's sort of this complete anonymity when there's actually different levels of difficulty. And so from my perspective, it's not that we don't know how to trace it. There is a trail, if you will, but it's the amount of resources that it takes to investigate all of those leads. We are not devoting those resources accordingly to what the crime and what the threats are suggesting we should.
Thank you, Aman. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think Valerie mentioned, I think people really overestimate the traceability or sort of underestimate the traceability of crypto assets. You just think sort of one of the most recent example of the, I think it was a couple who got indicted on charges of money laundering, I believe it was, sort of hundreds of thousands, if not millions in Bitcoin. And I believe I read reports that they managed to trace Bitcoin back, even retrieve it, or they're working on retrieving it. And so it seems like we're clearly moving towards a world where it's much more of a possibility. Just on the sort of global impact of it, I think, again, that's sort of something that we're sort of very wary about, which is, again, why we sort of don't recommend a blanket ban. It's only because, this is a global phenomenon. It's a transnational issue, right? And so, we're sort of very much hoping that regulations at some point standardize across various jurisdictions, only because that seems to be the only feasible way to prevent, a financial market collapse in any one dominant economy sort of cascading into a global financial collapse.
Great. Well, thank you guys. We have more questions, all of which I'm actually fascinated by. So I wish we had more time for this, but maybe we should do a follow-on conversation at some point. Now, in just the last minute that we have left, just wanted to open it up, Valerie, to closing thoughts from you, from Aman, anything else that you would like to cover before we lose you?
Sure. I'll just say that I hope people, or at least I think of cryptocurrency regulation as just, cryptocurrency is just the next technology. And we've had to update regulations and technology before. So it's not this impossible task. There is a fundamental model to work off of. I don't want people to think this is insurmountable, right? But obviously it's different. And so obviously it has to be tailored to what it is.
Thank you. I appreciate ending on a note of optimism there, Valerie. Aman, anything, no pressure to be optimistic, but anything that you would add before we lose you?
No, just echoing the same sentiments. We spoke about diversity in this case. I really do hope more and more people get involved in the crypto asset regulation debate, more voices that have not traditionally been heard in cyber and digital spaces get involved. So yeah, just sort of hoping for that to happen.
Likewise. Well, thank you both so much. This has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you to everyone in our audience for the great questions. Really appreciated those. This is the last in our series, I think, for this season, and then we'll be opening up again in the spring quarter. April 5th through June 7 will be our next set of conversations. with this group. So really looking forward to having you all join us back on April 5. Imagine you can look at the website as we start filling in who our speakers are for those conversations. But in the meantime, thank you, everybody. And a special thanks to Valerie and Aman and colleagues at Stanford for putting this together. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you guys back in a few weeks. And in the meantime, take care. Bye, all.